With the release of James Gunn's Superman this weekend, kicking off the DCU, we've been going back and reviewing all the Superman movies, and today we come to the end of that journey. For today, we are talking about Henry Cavill's first and only solo outing in The Cape. Hi, my name's Zach. We are reviewing 2013's controversial Man of Steel. Like many of you, I started this YouTube channel because I cannot watch a movie without needing to talk about it afterwards. And if that sounds like you, you're in the right place. Consider hitting that subscribe button. Also, while I'm talking, I want this to be a dialogue between me and you. So comment down below all your thoughts and opinions on Man of Steel. I'm sure there's a lot of them out there, and I'd love to hear your story. Now, when it comes to Man of Steel, I've talked about my experiences with all of these Superman films as I've reviewed them. I talked about how Christopher Reeve, he was around in my childhood, but he wasn't really one that I grew up with that intensely. Superman Returns is the first Superman movie in my lifetime that I remember actually coming out, but Man of Steel is by far the Superman movie I've seen the most, because this came out when I was 14 years old. It was basically prime time for me as a comic book movie fan. I had friends who were really into Man of Steel. We watched this together constantly. This kicked off the DCEU, so you know that as new movies were coming out, I was going back and doing my DCEU rewatches leading up to each and every film. So I've seen Man of Steel many times, but the controversy around this film was blind to me for a number of years. It wasn't until I really started to get into the internet and into the troll culture of the internet, start to understand there's some people on the internet who like to talk negatively. And it wasn't until I found those comments and those people online that I found out that Man of Steel was actually a pretty controversial film when it came out. So, as normal, we're going to go through what worked for me in the film, what didn't work for me in the film, but we're also going to throw in a new segment of the controversies, because there's some moments in this film that are very controversial that I would like to add my 2 cents to. With all that out of the way, let's just get started with what worked about Man of Steel. And when it comes to Man of Steel, Snyder and his crew had a lot of terrain to explore with this film. We really only had Christopher Reeve's very colorful comic booky films and Brandon Routh's Superman, which was connected to the Reeves world, to go off of when Man of Steel was coming out. This is also a script done by David S. Goyer. It's produced by Christopher Nolan, because if you don't know the story, Christopher Nolan and David S. Goyer, when they were trying to crack the story for The Dark Knight Rises, they took a week off and ended up writing this Superman script.
We were just stuck. We were blocked. And Chris said, okay, let's just take a week off. And I went back and reread a volume of the first Action Comics. And then I wrote maybe a 3-page outline for a Superman story. And we met with Chris, and he said, did he crack? And I said, no, but I have an idea for a Superman movie.
And Christopher Nolan presented it to Warner Brothers. They were interested in the story. And Christopher Nolan brought on his friend Zack Snyder to execute the vision for Man of Steel. And one of the big things that sticks out to me about Man of Steel is they really lean into the alien factor of the character of Superman, where you get started in this film and you're on Krypton, and it is a fully fleshed out sci-fi looking world. It basically looks like Middle Earth meets Pandora. You spend a lot of time with Jor-El, and you spend a lot of time with Zod on this planet as they are establishing their conflict before we even get to the story of Superman being sent off of the planet. And that gives Man of Steel a very science fiction feel, not just a comic book movie feel, to its entire movie. It also allows for this to feel like more of an epic than I think a lot of the other Superman films that we've covered have been able to feel. And when you do get off Krypton and you meet Henry Cavill as Superman, a big change for his character for Man of Steel is this is a Superman who hasn't found his identity yet. In fact, a lot of the first act of this film, when we meet Henry Cavill, he's a man exploring the world, trying to find who he is. And that's just a very interesting, different look at the character of both Clark Kent and Kal-El. Because in the other films, and I'm not just going to compare Man of Steel to the other films that we've covered, but it is a huge departure from what we've gotten before, because in those films, it was just this fantasized Superman. He had the confidence. He knew what he was supposed to do. He was there to protect humanity. It's very fascinating that David S. Goyer, Christopher Nolan, and Zack Snyder decided to take this character and have him be a character who's struggling with his place in the world. He doesn't have all the answers. He hasn't been learning about Krypton. He doesn't have his daddy Jor-El on the hologram talking to him yet. And in fact, throughout the journey of the movie, as he's discovering more about himself, we also get to learn and discover more about him. And Henry Cavill in this film, I think, just does a really good job. This Superman has been criticized heavily for being broody, for being angsty, for being that Superman that's just kind of down and dire on the world. But I don't really get that sense from Henry Cavill when I watch this movie. He's definitely a Superman that's not completely sure of himself, but the core essence of Superman, that guy who just wants to help and protect people, that is still there. And I love how this film, much like David S. Goyer and Christopher Nolan did with Batman Begins, they don't tell it in a linear fashion. It goes back and forth with these flashbacks, showing us Clark's upbringing, showing us the first time he gets powers, and the way that they depict the first time he gets powers. And he is horrified in the classroom. He's seeing through his teacher. He's hearing things that he shouldn't be able to hear, and no one can understand him. It's a much more intimate look into Superman than we have ever gotten to see before. Now, with Superman, of course, you've got to have a great antagonist to go along with it, and that is Michael Shannon as Zod. And what I love about Michael Shannon as Zod is that he's tied all throughout the entire narrative of this film. We see him at the beginning, his conflicts with Jor-El, how that transfers over to him being sent to the Phantom Zone when Krypton blows up and he gets out of the Phantom Zone, how that conflict then transfers over to between him and Kal-El. But I also love that the introduction to Zod in this film creates a alien invasion type story for this film, because one of the big points of the pitch that Christopher Nolan and David S. Goyer originally gave for this story is that if Superman was a real person on our Earth, it would change everything about humanity, what they believed, and how we lived. And this movie absolutely captures and executes that out, I think, in a really realistic fashion, where the world does stop. It pauses as soon as Zod enters the picture. And the world that was before, that we're following in the first act, into the second act, it completely shifts and changes once the Kryptonian ship of Zod's enters the atmosphere. And it also does a lot for the character of Kal-El at that point too, because that's his whole crisis for the rest of the movie, trying to keep both the Kryptonian part of him and the humanity part of him alive. And I guess before we get into what didn't work for me, this is a good transition point to get into the controversies around Man of Steel. You got to talk about the big, huge, hour-long fight that goes on between Zod and Superman in this movie. It is absolutely bonkers. It is so crazy how long and how exaggerated and just how big and scaled this fight gets. It starts off in Smallville, it eventually moves over to Metropolis, and it just goes on and on and on as Zod and Superman are beating each other up and throwing each other through buildings, and it can get to be a lot, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next section here. But what I love about the fight sequences between Zod and Superman in this film is that they are trying to create a down-to-earth, grounded, realistic Superman for our modern age. And if you've got two godlike beings, two Kryptonian creatures fighting on Earth relentlessly, nothing's going to stop them. Buildings aren't going to stop them. Zod's not giving Superman a second to breathe. He's constantly pounding him. Things are going to get destroyed. People are going to die. That is the realistic outcome of this fight in our world. And the fact that David S. Goyer and Christopher Nolan and Zack Snyder stuck to that, in some cases For some people, they stuck to it too realistically. I personally like that. It allows me to buy into the film a lot more when I fully believe that what's going down on screen is what would be going down on screen. And it's not like Superman's using people to throw at Zod, or he's deliberately allowing people to get hurt to further hurt Zod. It's simply the fact that Zod doesn't care about the humans. Superman hasn't fought really anybody, let alone Kryptonian beings of his own strength and size. He would get knocked around. He would get tossed around. It would not be an easy fight for him. And I love the way that the film depicts that. The second thing I think we got to talk about is Jonathan Kent. A lot of people have problems with Jonathan Kent. He pops up a lot throughout the flashbacks in Clark's life. And he's the one who, throughout the entire narrative, whereas Jor-El is more on the side of Clark or Superman being a hope and a light for people and being the hero he will eventually be, Jonathan Kent had a very strong belief that the world wasn't ready for him, and he basically is the encapsulation of what David S. Goyer and Christopher Nolan were originally pitching with the story of this film, that if Superman was on Earth, actually came here, it would change everything and people would not be ready. And that is the basis of the entire Jonathan Kent character. And so, of course, him instilling that in Clark as he's growing up, when it comes to the character's death, which is probably the most criticized moment in all of comic book movie history. When that tornado's going on and the dog's stuck in the car and Jonathan Kent goes back to get the dog, his foot gets stuck on the seat. The tornado's coming behind him and Clark is about to go save him, but Jonathan Kent just holds his hand up to tell his son to stay put, and Clark obeys. And yes, it's true that Superman in that moment could easily have just gone, grabbed him, and he'd be safe. But what I love about that moment is that the film has done such a great job of establishing where Jonathan Kent's values, ideologies, and beliefs stand when it comes to Clark revealing his identity. He believes that humanity's not ready and that Clark has to be very, very careful and particular with when he decides he's going to reveal himself to the world and change everything we know. So in that moment, that is Superman recognizing his father's core beliefs about him and honoring his father, that he believes that so strongly that he is willing to sacrifice his life for it. Jonathan Kent, he put the money where the mouth is. He let himself get taken and die because he believes so firmly that the world's not ready for his son at that moment. And for me, I think that just really works. I think that that works for the dynamic established between Clark and Jonathan Kent. I think that is a really respectful end to the characters' relationship. And it also is a big motivating factor for Clark, as we see in the rest of the movie, to really go and find out about himself and to learn more about what he can do and when is the right time to do it in this film. And so, yes, the argument that Superman could have just gone and saved his dad and revealed himself to that group of people at that moment because he could have easily saved Jonathan Kent, on the surface is a fine argument, but everything that's going on deeper within the characters, and especially when it comes to the character of Jonathan Kent, I think it's a really beautiful moment between father and son, that his son respects his beliefs so much that he let himself sacrifice for those beliefs. And that's just my opinion. Like I said, it's controversial. Not everyone's going to agree with that. The last thing I think controversial that we should talk about before we move on to what didn't work for me in the film is, of course, the breaking of Zod's neck at the end of the film. And this is possibly second most controversial in all of comic book movies, behind Jonathan Kent's death. Two in the same movie. Man of Steel doesn't hold back. And that's what I love about this moment, is that Man of Steel doesn't hold back. David S. Goyer and Zack Snyder they give Superman a real life conflict where he has to decide if he's going to be with humanity or if he's going to give Kryptonite another chance. And that goes with the character of General Zod because, as mentioned before, Zod is an unstoppable Kryptonian creature that even during the fight in the final part of Man of Steel, he says to Kal-El, this ends two ways. Either you die or I do. Because Zod ain't going to stop. So when he's got that family cornered and he's lasering his eyes towards them and Superman's pleading with him, don't do it, stop, stop. Zod continues, I'm going to keep killing for everyone you save. I'm going to kill a million more. And so what's Superman in that moment really supposed to do? Because Zod is not going to be stopped by handcuffs. He's not going to be put in jail. There's nothing humanity can do to stop Zod. If Zod wants to destroy humanity, there's no one who is going to be able to stop him. So the killing of Zod, Superman making that final blow to his neck, I think works for two reasons. Because Zod was going to be unstoppable and Superman has to choose between, is he going to save humanity or is he going to join the Kryptons? Is he going to join with Zod? Obviously he's not going to do that, so he's got to kill Zod. But I also love that it shows that was not an easy decision for him to make, because immediately after he kills Zod, he falls to his knees and he mourns. Now, is he mourning the death of Zod? Partly. But he's mourning the death of his people. He's mourning the death of Krypton, because he is now and forever the last Kryptonian that he'll ever know of. And I love that David S. Goyer in the script didn't give Superman a cop-out, didn't give him an easy way out. Killing Zod is the hardest thing that this Superman has ever had to do in his life. And I love that they commit to him having to make that decision. Because it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for the character. Obviously, it wasn't easy for the fans. But in terms of the story and the narrative and the character dynamics and the character motivations, it was literally the only way Superman could stop Zod. So I personally love that moment. I think it's great. So those are kind of the main controversies I wanted to talk about. There's obviously a lot more with Man of Steel than that. But with that said, let's move on quickly to what did not work for me about Man of Steel. And I think that a recurring thing that comes up with me is Superman and Lois and their relationship. And here you have Amy Adams playing Lois Lane, who I think is probably the best Lois since Margot Kidder, now that I've watched her again. She's very good with the reporting side. I feel like she's got a lot of that brass and feisty energy that Kidder had with the character, and I just like that part of the character, and I think Amy Adams does a pretty decent job with that. But I didn't really buy into the chemistry between Amy Adams and Henry Cavill in this film, and I feel like the friendship part of their relationship is a little bit stronger than the romantic part that the film tries to establish of their relationship. And by the end of the film, when Superman saves her as she's falling after destroying the world engine, and she and him exchange a kiss, I just didn't really feel the spark. I didn't really feel like the magic was there. And I think Lois and Superman is a very important aspect to the character to get right. And I just didn't feel like the two leads here had the chemistry of the characters to make me really buy into their relationship, even though I liked their friendship more than I liked their relationship, which I thought was kind of interesting. Another thing here too is there's some Zack Snyderisms in here that are kind of annoying. There's a lot of moments where it feels like he's shooting with a handheld camera and he's zooming in and out on various objects as they're flying around the space, or he's zooming in closer to a scene that's going on, and the zoom ins kind of take me out of the movie a little bit, as they're used very frequently. On top of what's used kind of frequently is those flashback scenes that go on with younger Clark. At a certain point in the movie, it feels like they should have stopped using them, but they keep using them. And I feel like the flashback scenes start to get pretty repetitive, and they start to just keep saying the same thing over and over and over again. So I feel like we could have used a little bit less of them. And the third act battle of destruction that goes on in this film, while it's incredibly cool and incredibly choreographed, and it's just big and epic in size, it does also go on for a very long time. And there is a point where there are so many explosions, there's so many buildings getting destroyed, there's so many reshot scenes of Superman getting thrown, flying through buildings, and Zod and him punching, that it does start to become a lot of noise. And like I said, the battle goes on for like at least 45 minutes, if not an hour. And it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to keep processing. And I feel like there could have been a condension done. They could have condensed it down a little bit before it starts to overstay its welcome. But other than those few things, I think Man of Steel is a pretty interesting take on the character of Superman. I understand it's not everybody's cup of tea. It may not even personally be my favorite iteration of Superman, but I love how much the film commits to the idea of keeping Superman in this realized, realistic world. I think for this film, it really does work. I think Henry Cavill gives a great performance as Kal-El. I love the self-discovery journey that the character goes on. By the end of the film, I always do feel like he has become Superman by the time the credits roll. It's definitely not a perfect film, but it's one that I'm always interested in. I'm fascinated by. I think it's highly entertaining, especially the battle sequences that go on. They're easily the best Superman action that we've had up until this point of all the Superman films. So for that reason, I'm going to give Man of Steel a solid recommend. I personally really enjoy this film. And now that we've gone and talked about each of these Superman films, and I've gone back and watched each of these Superman films going into James Gunn's Superman, I've enjoyed many of them. But I feel like the best Superman film is still yet to be made. And I think James Gunn might just be able to do that. And we're going to talk about that this weekend. Be sure to check out my other Superman reviews if you haven't yet. I got the playlist right up there. Right down there is a ranking of the Batman movies. I haven't talked about Batman vs. Superman in this review series because I'm not doing the team-up films. But if you want to hear my thoughts briefly, it's in that ranking down there. And you can check out the most recent video over there. As always, guys, don't just watch movies, talk movies. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time, and I'll see you this weekend for Superman. Take care.